Thank you, Chris, for those warming words. And now, let's get started. Our first presentation today is related to the area of active methodologies, and it is an honor to introduce Dr. Robert Swartz, who is presently the director of the Center for Teaching Thinking in USA and the Spanish Center for Teaching Thinking in Madrid, Spain. He was an undergraduate at Harvard University, graduating in 1957, where he also received his doctorate in 1963. He has been a regular university faculty member teaching philosophy at the university level from 1963 to his retirement as a full professor in 2002. He is presently an emeritus faculty member at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. Dr. Swartz has also acted as a thinking skill testing consultant with the countrywide National Assessment of Educational Progress in the USA. And he's presently a member of the organizing committee of the International Conference on Thinking, a conference that brings together the most active thinking-oriented practitioners, researchers, and theoreticians biannually as it moves around the world. Let's welcome Dr. Robert Swartz.
And thank you to Rafa and Maita for getting things organized and ready for this presentation. And I will tell you that I'm looking forward to doing it myself. Although I put it together in a certain way with my colleagues, and I'm anxious to share with you the ideas that I have. So why don't we go on to the startup slide? Okay. So sponsored by the Richmond Solution group, and what I'm going to really talk to you about today is something that I find quite exciting. So let's have the next slide. Okay, and I am from the Center for Teaching Thinking. I've been working on how to help students learn to think for themselves, think carefully and well, okay, and develop a whole range of important thinking skills that they can use when they're thinking and learning. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to talk about how we can move away from the tradition of the 20th century that is still showing its face in the 21st century and in 21st century classrooms, in which students are rewarded if they can memorize more than other students and give it back on tests, and they consider that learning. Something we know actually does not really yield much learning other than specific things that they've memorized. And in this century, we've tried to switch so that we can help students learn how to be active, think for themselves, but not just that, be self-motivated and guide themselves in successfully thinking things through that need to be thought through carefully, and in learning new things that they have to learn in order to be able to do that. And that's really what the topic of today's presentation is. So let's switch to the next slide. Okay, now we know that on this planet, there are lots of things that happen that animals contribute to, in this case, peacock, okay, that involve creativity in nature, and what we consider creativity in nature, okay? And it's everywhere. But, next slide, please. It's human beings, as we know, that have been the ones to have dominated, okay, the role of their thinking and their creativity in making this world work and work better for not just themselves as individuals, but for everybody. So creativity is around us, okay, and not just from peacocks, but from us. New York City, if it wasn't for our creativity, our productivity, okay, our motivation, that wouldn't exist. People wouldn't be playing tennis, etc. However, there are problems that arise, as we know, because sometimes people don't think very carefully when they're doing things, even though they have the ability to create great cities like New York City. Okay, sometimes they make mistakes, like this ship that many of you have heard about, okay, an Italian liner, okay, that after entering, the straits to the place that they are going to be landing, okay, the ship actually capsized. It ran into some rocks that were at the bottom that the captain didn't realize were there, okay, and shifted the ship and tipped it over. Okay, and certainly good thinking, good learning, good investigation would have eliminated that problem. So let's go on to next slide and let's start thinking about how it is that we can help everybody to become great, skillful thinkers and learners, and to be as productive as the teams of people who put together the Golden Gate Bridge, the George Washington Bridge, the city of New York, and all the other wonders that humans have created around the world. Well, traditional classrooms, we know, okay, all the way up into the 1900s, they usually arranged in rows with students sitting in rows. And the teachers are up at the front, and all the kids are supposed to watch the teachers, listen to what they say, and remember what they say. And they're not allowed to talk to the other students. They have to learn and memorize these things for themselves. Well, that's a little different these days. There are many classrooms that have changed. And let's take a look at the next slide, and you'll be able to see exactly what I mean. This is just about the opposite. Where's the teacher? He's not saying anything or doing anything. He's not up on a platform. He's walking around, and he's watching these kids who are in groups of 3 or 4 working together, learning things that he didn't give a lecture about. They're learning them for themselves. And of course, he's there to help them if they need a little bit of help, but they're learning how to do it themselves. Next slide, please. Okay, so I focus now on one group, and here's a group. There are 3 kids here. There's a young lady who's sitting behind one of the boys, but they're all looking at this image. I think it's a photograph or a drawing, a piece of artwork representing, okay, an ecosystem, representing a portion of a forest that has fallen trees that animals live in, et cetera, et cetera. And it's an ecosystem that has survived and flourished for hundreds of years. And they're asking the question, how come? How could this be? If a tree falls over, it usually gets rotten and dies. Okay. And if animals are looking for food and other animals have snatched the food up, well, they're going to starve. So how come? Next slide, please. And they're looking closely at this photo, which we can't see very well, but it's a photo or a very good representational drawing of a portion of an ecosystem. And what do you see there? You see, of course, fallen trees, but you see snakes, you see insects, you see flying birds, you see animals, you see lots of vegetation around. Okay. And if there was sound, you'd hear the sound of maybe a little brook that ran nearby. Okay. Now, how come this ecosystem has survived and flourished for years and years and years, when in other circumstances, there's just rot and decay? Interesting question, but they're trying to figure this out to learn about this, figure it out for themselves. Next slide. Well, I've sketched out here something that I hope you can all read. Okay, but if you can't read, maybe I'll make these available to you in the way you can. But just the contrast between, teaching and learning in, the previous century mainly, of course, up through the 1900s, early 1900s too, where learning is based on, lectures and memorization out of books, and in which the students are pretty much passive in their learning, memorizing things, versus these students now are active. And that doesn't mean they're moving around. That means they're active in their thinking and learning to try to figure out what's going on here that they're observing. And maybe, how they can help to make it work better, or maybe not, how they can preserve it. Okay, so that's the right-hand side, and that's a sketch about active thinking. It's thinking in which students think together, in which students don't respond to students lecturing, telling them things, but the teachers prompt the students with questions, interesting questions. Okay, and they learn how to think about these things, how to answer these questions, think carefully and think well, in order to achieve an objective, in order to learn whether or not some view that they have developed about what's happening is correct. So the learning is primarily on thinking here in this context, where the students are active, guiding themselves, versus passive. On the passive side, how do students get grades in school? Well, they have to give back to the teachers what they've memorized, and if they got it right, if they give back exactly what they learned in the textbook, or maybe slight modifications, and that's it, they get high grades. In this case, it's if the students really come to learn, understand, can explain well, a variety of things that they've been thinking about that they are not learning about by reading things in textbooks or listening to teachers, but they're figuring out themselves. Active learning. And what, of course, the research has shown, and I have plenty of it around if anybody is interested after I do this presentation, I'll be glad to refer you to things you can read. The research shows that understanding, motivation, learning in breadth, is what we find on the right-hand side as the norm, in contrast to just being able to give back particular things that students have memorized on the left-hand side. Although maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration about passive learning. Still, there is this contrast. So let's go on and let's take a deeper look at this. How do students become more active, more self-guided learners themselves? Next, please. Okay, well, I want to break this down into some important components, because these kids aren't just doing anything and they're not just talking together. They're talking together and thinking together in specific ways. They're trying to do it skillfully. Instead of, for example, the way most people make decisions in the world today, they think for a few seconds and they make snap judgments. They decide what they're going to do and they do it. And unfortunately, most of the time, turns out that wasn't the right decision to make. They hadn't really thought it through carefully. They needed to think more skillfully. Well, these kids are learning how to play tennis. I tried to find examples of the same child, but I didn't. But in the first one, this child, he has a tennis racket and a ball, but he doesn't know exactly what he's going to do with it. Well, the second slide, this student is being helped by an instructor who helps him to learn, by doing, how to hit the ball, how to hold the racket so that it goes over the net, et cetera. And then in the last slide, the kid who's doing it is playing tennis beautifully, having learned how to do it. is very skillful at his tennis playing. How can we help students become more skillful in the way they think, so that they don't just think and come up with snap judgments? Next slide, please. Well, here's an example of what I call a thinking map. And it's related to the kind of thinking I mentioned before. Of course, there are lots of different ways to think. The kind of thinking I mentioned before was decision making. And the question is, instead of making snap decisions, not thinking them through carefully, how can we think through our decisions carefully so that we can feel that we have really made decisions that are well thought through and are probably good decisions to make? Okay, well, the teacher works with these students initially when they're learning how to do these things, okay, and raises that question, maybe asks the students to come up with some examples of decisions they've made that haven't worked out too well, and then ask them, well, how could you have thought through that decision more carefully so that you might not have made the mistakes you made? And the students and the teacher says, why don't you make a list of questions you'd want to ask and try to get answered before you decided to decide what you needed to decide? And they develop what I call a thinking map for skillful decision making. And here's the list. I'll read it to you, that the students together have contributed to making what I call a thinking map. Okay, making a set of directions that they can follow to try to think through their decisions more carefully. So let's find out why we have to make a decision here. Why is this decision necessary? And let's think about the different things we could do. Okay? And then let's try to think about, for each of these different things we could do, what might be the consequences if we did them? And we're not going to just do them and find out the consequences, because some of these consequences might not be so good. And that's a hint, because these kids said not just the good consequences. We're not going to read an advertisement for, Fruit Loops for breakfast cereal, and in which the advertiser says that having Fruit Loops for breakfast every day is like eating, apples, good, healthy apples, regularly, okay, to keep you healthy and in good spirits, okay? And you're not going to decide, I want to go and buy Fruit Loops for that reason. We're going to think about the consequences of doing the decisions that we thought we might be able to make, and try to figure out what are the beneficial, the good consequences, and not just for me, but maybe for others. But also, let's find out if there are some negative consequences, some disadvantages, because maybe it'll be nice to make this decision this way, but maybe the disadvantages outweigh the good things so much that we think, well, maybe not. Maybe doing this we'll be able to get what we want and live a happier life, but think of all the other people who will suffer if we make this decision in this way. No, let's look at some other possible decisions we could make and think about their consequences. And then let's think about the importance of their consequences, these kids said. Okay, and then based on, comparing the consequences of the possible decisions, let's decide what we think is the best to do. Or we might say, I guess I really can't decide. Some of these seem pretty equal. Okay, let me think it through a little more. That's what I call a thinking map, where the students are taking care to think through answers to questions they raise so that they'll be in a better position to decide at the end, whether to do what they're thinking of doing this way or that way. Thinking map. Great. Next slide. Okay, now in classrooms where students do this. Teachers usually say to students, well, let's think about decision making now. We made a decision. Some of you made decisions last week to do so-and-so, and they didn't turn out too well. How can you make better decisions? And they develop thinking maps, and they decide, well, we're going to put these on the wall so that we'll remember whenever we have to make decisions, we'll be able to follow this scheme. Now, of course, after a while, they're going to be doing this enough so that they don't want to get dependent on what's hanging on the wall. So they take these down from the wall and they try to base their decision making on their recollection of the strategy that they used that worked out the best in the past. Great. Next slide, please. And this isn't just for older kids, okay, where their decisions actually, even in Bachelorado, might turn on specialized knowledge in the sciences or in history, okay? And what we found is that if you start kids when they're little kids, okay, when they're in grades prior to the first grade, okay, you can get them used to doing these things. And of course, they'll develop thinking maps that are simpler, but sure, that's okay. All right, what are the good things that I could do? What'll happen if I do them? And which is the best? That they call this choosing. This is their thinking map for skillful decision making, although they don't know what skillful decision making means yet. But still, they're going to have a chance to do this. The teacher will come up with examples, about what you might want to choose to have for lunch, okay, or what you're going to do in the playground when you have recess, etc. So they come up with examples that relate to the kids' personal experience here, okay. And then as they grow up through the grades, their thinking maps get more and more sophisticated. The challenges that they deal with get more and more sophisticated. And because they have such great success in their decision making, okay, they get more and more motivated to do this every time they have to make a decision. Excuse me for 1 second. So let's move on and take more of a look at how this all works. Because remember, what we're aiming at is to take a look at how teachers can do things in school that move away from old styles of teaching to styles of teaching that help students to become active in their thinking and in their learning. They do it themselves. They work together in groups, help each other, etc. Okay, rather than having to memorize things. What they decide they want to accept as, something that is workable and acceptable, they have thought through themselves through their active learning. Now, what more does that involve? Let's have the next slide. Here's another example now of thinking maps that students have developed, this time for a different kind of thinking, not decision making, okay, but what I call, okay, just to give it a name, you give it any kind of name that's similar, I call this causal explanation. Something has happened, and we want to find out what caused it to happen so that we can fix things so that it doesn't happen again. You're driving on the highway, making a trip, all of a sudden your car stops, it breaks down. Why? What's causing it to stop? Could be I'm out of gas, or maybe not. Maybe something else more serious has happened. Let me try to find out so that I can then hopefully try to fix it or find somebody who knows who can fix it. So I'm going to do skillful causal explanation. And I want to say that, we talk about decision making, problem solving, different kinds of thinking. We also talk about creative thinking, critical thinking. Well, this is an example of critical thinking. This is a type of critical thinking. And these older students have developed a thinking map to help them guide themselves through this process so that they can feel assured in the end that they found what is the cause or the most likely cause of the automobile not continuing on the road. And then they can really try to find some experts who know how to fix these things or try to fix it themselves. And I put in little kids too. They don't call this causal explanation. They don't know, then they haven't learned those words yet. But finding causes, finding out why something has happened, simpler thinking map. And think of the development of their ideas about how to find the real causes of things from this shorter one that the younger kids have developed all the way up through bachillerato, where they're really serious. And when something happens, they really need to think very carefully and well to make sure that they get the right cause. Next slide. Now, I want to say there are many, many different types of thinking. And I'm not sure you can read these, but maybe we can help you by, after this is over, okay, make available or tell you how you can get copies of this where you can really see the clusters. But this follows 3 categories that an early researcher about thinking developed, although he didn't have the same examples of thinking underneath each. But Benjamin Bloom is the name of this fellow who worked in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s on thinking and how to classify the different kinds of thinking. Well, I mean, the first group is a group of thinking that you would call creative thinking, different ways of coming up with creative ideas. Second is when you have something, an idea, something happens, you try to analyze it, try to figure out what's going on, what its different components are, how they work, etc. Okay, third category is the category of critical thinking. Is the information you're getting information that's reliable and good information that you should accept? Should you believe everything? Even your own observations. You think you see a tiger in your backyard? Wait a minute now. Let's wash your face and go take a look again. Okay, and maybe there is a tiger, maybe not. Okay, so we want to help students, the Benjamin Bloom said, develop their critical thinking skills, and there are a number of them, like predicting consequences as well as finding out why something has happened the way it did. So there are possible thinking maps for all of these. Okay, and let's go on to the next slide. I want to just bear down on a few. So now let's think about those thinking maps. It's not enough to develop a thinking map and write it down and say, here's a great way to figure out what's causing something to happen. Here's a great way to figure out what the best thing I should do is, period. Having thinking maps alone, they're not going to help you very much. You have to put them in use. You have to use them. And I here like to compare that to somebody learning how to play the violin. When you first learn to play the violin, well, your violin teacher is going to say, well, hold your fingers this way, curl this way when you hit the strings. If you do it, if you bend your hand, it's going to let the strings vibrate too much and the sound will be terrible. So you learn how to play the violin that way, okay? Now, it's not enough to learn how to use your fingers more skillfully to get a good sound, to hold the bow instead of, at a 45-degree angle from the strings, okay, at a 90-degree angle from the strings, you get a better sound. Well, it's not enough to say that. You want to learn how to do that. So you know how to play the violin skillfully, you can tell people, but you've never done it. Well, that's pretty silly. But you want to show them how you've learned to do those things. The same with these thinking maps. More and more practice using these thinking maps for different kinds of issues having to do with finding causes about something, okay, making different decisions, okay. And you can't just use them in whatever way you want. You want to use them carefully and well and skillfully. So don't just hold the bow at 90 degrees from the strings when your teacher is watching. Then just fiddle around with it in whatever way you want and wonder why it keeps squeaking the same way. No, you want to keep practicing to do these things well. So, next slide. What about thinking skills? How can we do thinking, these types of thinking, more skillfully? And usually, okay, we do that through practice. We try to do things, follow the thinking map, and maybe we work together on problems and issues. Okay, we download questions about, causal explanation, what's causing this, okay, or what should I do? And we try to write down the answers to the questions instead of just talking about them. Talking about them, well, next week you're going to forget what you talked about. But let's try to download, let's try to write down the answers to those questions, stick with it, and then take the answers and explore them. Well, that involved the creation or the use of some already existing, but then creating special graphic organizers in classrooms. And teachers found these were wonderful. Students would write, instead of thinking about the different things you could do, some of them you mention once and say, no, I'm not going to think about that anymore. And the next day you forget what you mentioned. No, write them down and let's think them through carefully. And then let's follow the other questions on the thinking map and write down some answers there. So let's consider one possible thing you could do, and then let's write down, okay, what we think the consequences might be. And then let's consider whether the consequences are guesses or whether they're reasonable. Do we have any evidence that these consequences might occur? And how important are they? Are they pluses or minuses? Do they count in favor of you benefiting, okay, and other people not? Well, what are the pros and cons? Anyhow, this is an example of a graphic organizer designed by students, okay, following the thinking map so that when they talk together and think through a broader issue and use the thinking map, instead of talking, they can write down their ideas. Next slide. Here's another example now, more sophisticated for causal explanation, where at the top, what's the problem? Well, my car isn't working anymore. It stopped working. What are some possible causes? Maybe it's run out of gas. Okay. Well, what could I look for? What could I try to find out that'll help me decide whether it indeed has run out of gas? And then in the next column, what they put down as evidence. Okay, let's actually go look for those things. Let's go and see if the gas tank is empty and write that down. That's going to mean maybe it isn't your cause of running out of gas that has caused this problem. Okay, so you're working through the questions on the thinking map. You're writing them down in a way that represents the motion of your thinking from left to right. Okay, go on to the next slide, please. Where the students have filled in these, talked together, filled in the boxes, discussed together, and then decided in those little columns to the right that that's count in favor or against, okay, what's on the possible cause. In this case, these kids are trying to figure out why the Titanic sank. Now, everybody says the Titanic sank because it hit an iceberg. Well, why did it hit the iceberg was the question. And there are possible causes. Too foggy, they couldn't see. But maybe there are other possibilities. They write down the possibilities, and then they explore these one by one by trying to learn about the real situation back there when it was at 1914, when the Titanic sank. And they consider fog. Was it really foggy? What was the weather like? Let's go back and look at weather reports from that period. Okay, let's see if any are written down. Now that was out in the middle of the ocean. Let's see what the captain has in his log about the weather, etc. Well, notice how active and how exploratory the thinking of these kids are to try to come up with this conclusion. And they find that many of the explanations that they have come up with, okay, they don't find evidence to support them. So they put down question marks. We're not sure about this. We don't really have evidence. For example, the one on the top in the right-hand box says, well, it's heavy fog periodically every year between, okay, April so-and-so and April such and such. Well, if that was true, if you go back over weather analyses of previous years, and you find that that happens regularly this time of year, well, that counts in favor. Maybe it was foggy then. On the other hand, if they find out that's not the case, well, that counts against. Well, they found out that that was the case. Now, notice the active, self-guided learning that these kids are doing, trying to get evidence, trying to find things out, and the motivation they have for doing it. Incredible. Next slide, please. And they, by the way, came up with a conclusion that it was unlikely that it was fog that caused that disaster. Now, I put this in because I want to show you these kids, they love these graphic organizers. It's incredible. This is another student from another classroom, okay, working on another issue, another project. And, you know, she's happy to have her picture taken that way. Next slide, please. Okay, but now I've talked about, you know, specific things that students might want to think about using, you know, the kinds of thinking, causal explanation, okay, prediction, which we haven't talked about, other forms of thinking to think about, okay, and how they can learn. But I've talked about things that, you know, they may come up with not necessarily connected with anything they're learning in school. But now I like to use the word infusion. And I like the example of tea being infused through tea bags into cups of tea, cups of water. Okay, the great change that makes. Try to suck on a dry tea bag and you're not going to like it. Try to drink the hot water without the tea and you're not going to like it. But put the two together, infuse the tea bag in the water, and that's heaven. Well, let's infuse the use of these thinking skills in learning the important things that are there in your content curriculum. So let's go on to the next slide. And now, what teachers and what we all realize is that in our schools, we have a tremendous number of possibilities that have been used for other purposes. The book, well, just for learning words, for learning how to read, okay, these windmills, okay, now for learning about different possibilities for energy, okay, in more recent years, how those can be converted into topics and themes that you can then try to explore on your own or with other students together by doing active thinking, active exploration, okay, trying to think about, okay, in Charlotte's Web, a great story written in English, translated into Spanish, used in Spanish schools, okay, about a little girl, okay, and at first a bunch of animals, but then a spider. Okay, and there are lots of opportunities for challenges. You read up to a certain point in this book and you say, well, what should Charlotte do now? Well, stop and use skillful decision-making to try to figure that out yourself. You've got the information at the beginning of the book about what it's like there, etc. And the same with the other topics and themes. there in your classrooms, okay, already you've got materials that you can use to infuse thinking. Let's go on to the next slide. And now I'm going to show you some examples, pictures from classrooms of these things going on. Here, of course, are some kids sitting together, working together on a graphic organizer, connected with some thinking that they're doing. Okay, how closer together can you get in your thinking? Look at their heads together. Next slide, please. And these kids are on the floor. They've got so much material to spread out, okay, and they're all working together to try to figure out what they're going to put down on your graphic organizer. Next slide. Now here, these are some kids, okay, in a Spanish school in which this is a classroom for boys, in which the boys are working together on a topic or theme. The teacher is trying to teach some of these thinking skills, and they're used to working together. They're not seated in rows, they're seated in tables. And in the bottom left, you can't really see, but there's a student who has a cap on, who's been as an immigrant just arrived from another country, and they're welcomed into the collaborative team. They talk together, and now you can't see it also, but there's a hand with a pencil writing on a graphic organizer where they communicate their ideas to a student who's now in charge of entering them on the graphic organizer. Wow. Next. And here, this is in Amman, Jordan. Now, I've worked with schools all over the world about this, and I was invited to Jordan, and I did some workshops there, and I visited some schools. Well, this is a group of students who, of course, and this is a female classroom. Okay, they break the classrooms into girls and boys. Okay, and these little girls are trying to work with a graphic organizer, and they've got a question about how to write on the graphic organizer, and there's no reason for not asking the teacher. The teacher is not telling them what to write, but how to use this graphic organizer. Okay, wonderful. And I will tell you that this approach to helping students become more active, okay, and challenge students to do good thinking and learning has now spread around the world. Next, please. Okay, well, usually when you're thinking, you're aware of not your thinking or the kind of thinking you're doing, but what you're thinking about. You're thinking about, okay, your holidays in July, thinking about lying on the beach. Well, okay, what kind of thinking are you doing there? Maybe you're trying to make up a decision about which beach you're going to lie on, but still, what your attention is focused on are the facts about the different beaches. But you can switch that. Next slide, please. Switch it to where your attention is on your thinking. What kind of thinking are you doing? Okay, and that's then a starter in thinking about your thinking. How are you doing that kind of thinking when you do one of these, you respond to one of these complicated challenges now. You're in the upper grades, okay, serious and significant challenges using different kinds of thinking maps that you've already constructed. You don't have to do again. You know what they are in your head. You've used them many times, okay? So, but let's think about how you've thought that through. Next slide first. Next. That's what we call the ladder of metacognition. And this is, again, thinking about your thinking into a thinking map. This is what was done first. You're going to ask these questions. What kind of thinking were you doing? How did you do it? Okay. How about the conclusions you came to? Did they work out? Okay. And how are you going to do it next time you have to do it? And maybe when you think about question 3, you realize, wait a minute, the thinking map that I developed earlier that I used, I left something out. And that's why I kept on going off on tangents and not being happy with the kinds of solutions I was coming up with. Maybe I should change the thinking map. And that's your answer to the last question. Metacognition. A colleague of mine, David Perkins from Harvard University, Project Zero, he and I worked together in the 1980s and early 90s, and we developed this way of thinking about your thinking that got called metacognition. Next, please. And here's a photograph of a kid that students love it. Okay, they've drawn a picture of it. Okay, there's somebody going up the ladder. This is thinking about your thinking. What more abstract could that be? But wow, it's another thinking map and it's put in their own language. Next slide, please. In this classroom, they've actually written on the stairs, on the vertical metacognitive questions, except instead of starting at the bottom going up, they started at the top going down. So you can see the last question, how will you do it next time? And the next one that's highlighted is the previous one. How did it work? Okay, were you satisfied with the result? Okay, how did you do it? What kind of thinking? Whoa, next, please. And hanging, they got 5 or 6 of these hanging around the classroom. And the page you can't see, you can't make out, there's a drawing of the ladder of metacognition, reminding the students, stop and think about your thinking. Don't just go on and do it, but let's take thinking itself as something you might do too hastily. You might forget things. Next slide, please. Even little kids, these are infants, and they can move these images of the kids up the ladder. And the kids learn, of course, in their own way, how to think about their thinking. Wait a minute, I didn't think about this when I was doing it. Okay, so when they learn the different questions on the ladder of metacognition, of course, they don't use the word metacognition. Okay, whoa, their images get moved up the ladder. But in reality, next slide, please. These are the little kids, and there I am. I love to stay in those classrooms with those kids, see how they work. They're a little, feel self-conscious about being there together, but were they happy? Next slide, please. Okay. But we've only got to a certain point where you've thought about your thinking. Maybe you've changed it, maybe you haven't, but now you're going to complete it. And when you complete it, here is your graphic organizer that you were using in your collaborative group. But now there's a big one there that you can use, and you can enter all the things you thought of on the graphic organizer and show it to the rest of the class. Next slide, please. And you can explain to the rest of the class how you got that conclusion, how you decided to put this in your graphic organizer, etc. This is another student, a student from one of the groups in this. I think this is now a second level baccalaureate, not at SO level classroom. Okay, next slide. Well, here are now on the left, here are examples of the different stages in your teaching. There are the raw materials, the books that I showed you. Now the students working together in groups. Okay, and now they're reporting, how that all turned out. And in the middle, the slide going down or the stairway going down, okay, what I've listed there are different techniques that the teachers use and resources that they use to help students get used to going from the top where they're just reading a book, and they find something interesting, to a thinking challenge and a learning challenge, to more active thinking themselves, and to their conclusion, the finish. Next slide, please. And now this is where, almost to the end of my presentation, I've decided to summarize things okay, from kindergarten all the way up through life outside the classroom after you finish school and you finish college even. Okay, there are stages you go through. And what I've shown you represents primarily the first couple of stages here in becoming a good active thinker. Becoming a good active thinker and learner is to do that, to think actively and carefully and well, and to learn actively, carefully on your own, maybe with other people working with you, okay, and well. Okay, now your objective is to be able to do that. And I added to that to do it, okay, without thinking even. It becomes a natural way of responding to challenges, things you don't know about, things you need to find out about in the world. You're now older and you've gone through, in school, how many grades? You've gone through 9, 10, even 12 grades in school, okay? And you've gone through a progression. You're not going to be using the thinking maps and graphic organizers throughout the whole process. That's a starter. So, number one, you develop a thinking map and graphic organizer with other kids. 2, okay, a couple of weeks or a week later, the teacher challenges you with another issue that you can think through, okay, and you remember how you worked on the thinking map. You try to remember the thinking map, okay, and use it again, okay, with other students, okay, and the teacher is not playing such a strong role in there, not really helping you that much. You're trying to do it on your own. Next, the teacher gives you a cue, says, well, why don't you see if you can find, some important thinking questions in this book that we're reading now. We're now in the 5th or 6th grade. And then, try to guide yourself in what kind of thinking you're going to use and do it with your partners. Okay, and then gradually the teacher drops out. And those thinking maps and graphic organizers written down, you don't need them anymore. You got those in your heads. Finally, okay, in school and after school for the rest of your life, you're going to guide yourself. You're going to be an active thinker and learner. When the occasion comes up, you'll be self-motivated. You guide yourself in how you're doing it, okay? And you'll do it when you perceive it's needed. Wait a minute, I've got to figure this out before I can make a decision. You say to yourself, you don't say to anybody else, and you don't have to go find the graphic organizer. You don't have to create a thinking map. They're all there in your heads. You become self-motivated, self-cued. This is a time to do some careful thinking. Self-guided. Let me develop a thinking map in my head, okay? And I'm learning things. And we're doing it as we perceive they're needed. There's nobody around to prompt us. No teacher, not other kids, not our parents. It's like speaking the language. Next slide. Here we are together. Okay. Just like the violinists in a symphony orchestra, all thinking, caring, guiding ourselves, trusting each other and their ideas, talking together, creating things that will help us in our lives, help the people in the world in their lives. Okay? All by becoming active, careful, good thinkers and learners. And that is the end. Thank you very much.
Dr. Swartz, thank you very much for such a great presentation. And let me tell you that I'm personally passionate about this topic and promoting thinking skills and in general, successful thinking in class. Well, We have lots of questions from the audience, and I will address one of them. Isabella from Argentina is asking, why do we as teachers sometimes fear to break patterns? In this case, why do we fear to make the transition from the 20th to the 21st century classroom?
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't know, because I think there are a lot of reasons why people are anxious about all of that. One is because if they've learned in their teacher education programs, when they went to the university and they, learned how to be a teacher, they were taught by somebody who said, there's only one way to be a teacher. You give the kids the textbook and have them memorize what's in the textbook. So you begin to worry. They said, this is something new, and I haven't learned about it, and I'm anxious about it. Okay.
All
Now,
right.
of course, you can always come to people like me, because we do workshops for teachers, around the world on these things. But still, to be anxious, to say for many years, we've been asking kids to memorize things, okay? And, some of them have gotten good jobs and what have you. Okay, why do we need to change? Okay, good questions. So that's really why, a lot of people are anxious. Now, from my point of view, after they try their first lesson and see the response of the kids, they're not anxious anymore. Are you a teacher yourself?
Yes, I am.
Try this out and see if you're anxious after you've finished.
Well, definitely, I would be anxious, right? Yes.
We have another question. Thinking is a process and it takes training and practice. How long would it take a student to become a critical thinker?
Okay, now it does take some time, but it doesn't take that much time. We've solved the problem in a way, because we found that, we put together a set of 3 workshops. We do them, a month and a half or so apart, so that in between them, we can work with the teachers on designing their own lessons that follow what we've shown in the previous workshop, so that they gradually get used to doing this. And they've got somebody like me or one of my colleagues there who can go with them in their classrooms and support them and help them. There's that kind of support around. It's not there it's not everywhere, and it's not everybody who claims they can teach teachers how to teach thinking who knows how to really do this. But it's there, and it can be accomplished. We are trying to set up, for example, a group of schools that we call thinking-based learning schools, where the whole school has become TBL. Every teacher teaches this way, and they love it. And these schools now are going to work together, and they're going to make their services available to other schools. So, you need to find out about what's available of that sort. Okay, it isn't just Bob Swartz out there waving his flag alone.
Interesting answer. Thank you, Dr. Swartz. There's one more question. Benjamin from Chile writes, besides using pictures, would there be other basic thinking strategies to guide little learners and facilitate the decision-making and problem-solving?
Well, our feeling is that when we have that list I showed you that you couldn't read of the categories of different types of thinking, that's what we base it on. These are different types of thinking. I've only mentioned 2 or 3 of them. Okay, but if you count those up, there are about 25 or 30 different types of thinking, and there are many, many more, but these are types of thinking that we use every day of our lives. Predicting what's going to happen if you cross the street. Okay, make sure you look at the cars coming. Okay, then finding what the causes are so that it won't happen again. Okay, making decisions, solving problems. okay, sequencing things, ranking them, etc. Okay. So, I mean, what we've done is we have figured out that 3 workshops, and the workshops are about a day and a half long each, and we focus on 4 different kinds of thinking in each workshop. 3 of those is about as much as any teacher can stand who is doing the workshops when school is in session, when they're also teaching. Now, of course, one of the virtues of that is that they can bring these back to their classroom. Okay, but if we do 3 workshops with 4 different kinds of thinking, in each that's already 12 different kinds of thinking. And by the end of the 3rd workshop, most teachers have mastered this because they love TBL when they really get involved in it. Sometimes school principals come in, new principals come in, and they really are very traditional. I remember one principal saying to me, "Thank you for those 3 months you've worked with our teachers, but I'm going to bring them back to reading and writing. None of this thinking stuff anymore." And so and there are school boards. There are all sorts of different groups that have an investment in education. Textbook writers, although we've got some textbook writers who have changed the style of their textbooks. So anyhow, there's all of that we have to think about and people worry about. Is my school going to change back after 3 months and I've learned all this stuff? So those are challenges for us and for most people who do the same kind of thing that we are trying to do.
Dr. Swartz, we are deeply thankful for sharing all your experience and knowledge today. It is really inspiring all you have presented, and we certainly got a lot of infusing to do.
You're welcome. Let me just say something here, because I don't like to mix advertising with, doing something like this, but I will tell you that we are in the process of offering, to any teacher who wants to, online, these important workshops, and we've got more that go beyond that. Of course, what happens in their schools, well, that's a little more complicated, okay? But I will say that I've seen progress. I've seen changes. While there have been some occasions where the new principal comes in and says, "Nope, we're gonna go back to the old style." Okay, in most cases, it's quite amazing to me that, we keep up with it. But it's not just reaching the school principals, but it's the school board of your community. Now, it's amazing to me that in one of the regions in Spain, in the Basque Country, okay, the Board of Education is now thinking about putting TBL, thinking-based learning, into their, curriculum that goes out to every single school in the Basque Country. Now, when that happens, that's a wonderful thing. But of course, they get reelected every 3 or 4 years and things change. So, my feeling is that, we started working with parents and not just with kids. And once we start doing that, and in the community of adults, okay, who are interested in their kids learning things in school, okay, there we have many, many people who think this is wonderful. It helps them in their own lives. And it's all turning things back into active thinking, self-motivated. Okay, there's a problem, you want to solve it. Okay, and there's a solution and you know how to think it through. Okay, etc. And you can tell by looking at me that I'm not young anymore. When I started all of this, it was in the 1980s. Hey, but there are many more people who have taken this up and who are really interested in helping, not imposing this on anybody, but showing how it works and trying to get people to try it out in their classrooms and then helping, and they see that kids who were falling asleep in the classroom before, okay, who are now motivated, so motivated, in their own lives to really try to think through some of the challenges that occur, it's quite amazing. So I thank you for, having me come here and to explain how TBL works and how it really is a major way of getting into what is, to me, the right kind of learning, active learning.
Learning to think well, how exciting and important it becomes, Rafa, to teach our students how to think and how to think correctly, using all their potential to develop mental skills instead of just memorizing concepts or repeating information presented in the classroom, right?
That is so true, Mayra. And also, as we know, the use of active methodologies will help our goal to transform education and provide students with all tools they may need.